Hello and welcome, everyone. I am joined here with James Heywood, the head of content at Off the Class. Welcome, James. Thanks for being here.
Great to be here, Chris.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about grammar. We're going to talk about a lot, and this is people have really strong opinions about grammar. What does it mean to teach grammar? What actually is and isn't grammar? How does your personal experience, just in your life and as a teacher and even as a learner, how does that impact the way you teach grammar? When do you correct someone and when do you not correct someone? How do you even decide what is or what isn't correct? All of these are really important points when it comes to the teaching of grammar. And I think it's just really easy for us as teachers to want to define what is and what isn't a mistake. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about grammar as an overview. We're going to look at some example sentences and say, is this a mistake or isn't it? Talk about how to get the proper reference point for teaching grammar, and then explain a couple of methods to teach grammar, inductive versus deductive, for how actually is the best way to teach grammar, whether you're starting with the rules or you're letting the student kind of get warmed up and see the patterns in action. What is the kind of like the more authentic way? Where do they come together? So that's what we're here to talk about. So this is going to be a conversation. If people, we're doing this live. So if you are joining us here live and you have questions or you have something that you want to contribute to the discussion, please leave a comment and we'll address it as we go, especially when we start getting into the more interactive elements of looking at example sentences. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to James, who is going to bring us through the more structured presentation. So James, take it away.
Okay, thanks to everyone for joining us, and thanks for the introduction, Chris. I think, Chris, you and I have mentioned, well, I've certainly said to you before that I always feel that grammar and accent are two subjects for English teachers which will always provoke great discussions, hopefully sensible debate. So we'll deal with one of them today, and I hope if people can take away from this a deeper sense of what it means to them as teachers to teach what is grammar in an ESL online setting. So first of all, who is this aimed at? I think it's aimed at anybody, any teacher who is teaching ESL today in an online environment. What will be covered is shown in the this very slide here. And before I start, I just want to say that even if you have or consider yourself to have a very high understanding or deep understanding of grammar, I do believe you'll get something out of this. It's always great for us to think and reflect on what we think we know and where things are moving in an online environment today. So I'll go through these steps, talk very briefly about what is grammar. There are different definitions for it. Also, what is your grammar? I think it's important. The aim of teaching grammar to your students, the idea of reference books, which I think are vital not only for grammar, but for all areas of teaching skills in English as a second language. And then we'll go on to just a couple of the different styles of teaching grammar. So as we go on first of all, there are very different definitions. There are many that I have found online, but I think the division that I've wanted to draw here is, first of all, that grammar in the field of linguistics has obviously a scientific feel to it and brings in words like phonology, morphology, syntax, phonetics, semantics, pragmatics, etc. But if you look at the one underneath, and I'll read that one out, grammar is often a generic way of referring to any aspect of English that people object to. I think the writer may have had his or her tongue in cheek when this was written, but I think it's a great one to approach the idea of grammar in the ESL area, because the reality is sorry, I'll come back to comments in a minute. The reality is that we bring in more than just grammar when we're talking about correcting students in an online environment. It brings in the whole idea of, are you bringing in pronunciation and punctuation, which strictly speaking in a linguistic term are not included. So I'll go on to the next idea. As I mentioned before, I think that grammar evokes emotional responses, and it's important to have a look at your own ideas about grammar. And so the ones that I've put up here are helpful to me. And I think it's great for teachers to reflect. If you have a look at some of these, I think for me, the most important one is that I'm not teaching the grammar that I necessarily grew up with and that I consider as fixed and always correct. And it is certainly not the grammar necessarily that my teachers taught me, because things do change over time. The most important one is teaching grammar can lead to being a pedant, probably the least favorite person in any room. And that's something that I believe that all teachers, you want to become an expert or as good as you can in the teaching of grammar, but becoming pedantic about it can be very disadvantageous, especially for your students. So I'll go on to these particular sentences. Great reflection here. There are some examples I've pulled from feedback to us on the site. There are examples of things that I heard on the streetcar in the last week. And there are a couple that I have also purloined from websites recently, a couple of the news websites. So if you take a look at these, there may be something that you can say. Well, the question is, do you feel yourself that they are, as an English teacher, expressions of correct grammar? I don't believe there's a correct answer as yes or no. It's going to depend on the context to which you're teaching. And I won't go through all of the things here because the point, sorry, Chris.
No, keep going. I just want to talk about a couple of these, but keep saying what you were saying. So you don't want to go through all of them necessarily one by one.
No, but I would say the first cab off the rank is that's the woman I gave the book to. Some people perhaps were taught that prepositions don't come at the end of sentences. So whether you want to adopt that, is that a grammar rule that's worth teaching? First of all, do you find it correct? Do you find it somebody okay? As mentioned, the question is maybe, are they wrong? Are they okay? It doesn't really, what the idea was to kind of get you guys to people listening to think about it. Number 4, I think, is interesting.
Okay, wait a minute. I want to stop you here because this is interesting. Some of these don't look right to me.
Sure.
I'm an American, right? But
absolutely,
some of them look totally fine. Now, so what I do want you to do, without going into like spending too much time on each one, I do want you to go one by one. And I want you to say, if someone were to have a problem, this is what the problem would be. So number 1, because look, some people might look at number 1, especially an American. An American might look at number 1 and say, what's wrong with that? Nothing. I mean, we would say this, right? I say we, like the people that I interact with, other Americans in the part of the country where I live, generally speaking, no one thinks twice if you say this. So what's the potential problem? Ending a sentence with a preposition. So just for the people who might not be aware, because I'll be honest, I can look at some of these and I'm not even sure what the potential issue is. So why don't you just go and tell me what the potential issue would be for each one. And for people who are watching this later and want to comment on them, I've pasted them into a comment.
Okay, great. Well, as you mentioned, number 1 is the idea that preposition perhaps shouldn't appear at the end of an English sentence. Certainly in written English, people get strong about that one. The person that grabbed my bag, so it's a relative clause. Here, what you would say is, I was taught that the person who grabbed my bag, but I don't think that's even considered anything in North American English whatsoever anymore. When I entered the supermarket car park, my way was blocked by several trolleys. This really, for me, is about vocabulary, and students often bring in the idea of vocabulary. And as you know, Chris, this is something that comes up often between team members working with after class, because car park, I will say that until the end of my days, is, I've forgotten, I think it's a parking lot in North America. I'll never
parking
know.
lot. Yeah, I don't know
Okay.
what car park is.
And the trolley is something that is I
A
forgot
shopping
what it is.
cart.
Thank you very much. Okay, so it might, is it something that you bother teaching? And is
Right.
it me and Jeff? Okay, I get very worried about teachers who think they know the rules around pronouns and subject pronouns. It's far more complex than it appears, and I think me and Jeff is the one that would be sticking with a lot of teachers at the moment. None of the books was easy to read.
Okay, wait. Number 4, right? The issue is like, because if I think about when I was a kid learning, in my classes, it would have been like, no, Jeff and I, right?
Yes, you're correct. Yeah, you would use the subject pronoun.
Okay, so for each one, yeah, model. Now I get, okay, so number 3 is just there to highlight. There's nothing wrong with the grammar there. You're just highlighting the differences in regional vocabulary.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, because I would say when I entered the parking lot, my way was blocked by several shopping carts.
Yes.
Whereas if somebody said this, I would be quite confused, especially trolley, right? Trolley is something complete. Car park, I can get
Work it out.
But a trolley is a completely different thing. And if someone just says trolley, the last thing I'm going to picture is what is in my head, a shopping cart. Okay,
Sure.
all right. So keep going to number 5.
Number 5, none of the books, none traditionally was followed by a verb in the singular. I don't know that anybody bothers with that these days in spoken English. I'm not sure, but that traditionally it would have a single verb after it. What ways do you communicate with people?
So wait. Number 5 would be were?
Yes, for many people today, none of the books were easy to read. None of those people were waiting for me. What ways do you communicate with people? Okay, here I might have traditionally the incorrect interrogative, and it would be in which ways, perhaps in more traditional English. You will need a dice to play this board game. I have received over the last 10 years more feedback around die and dice than anything else. But again, its usage, both Oxford, I believe, or Cambridge, and certainly Merriam-Webster now accept dice as both the singular and plural form. If you're teaching that and stopping your students every time they say dice, I think you might just be wasting time there. But anyway, it's something to consider. And in the final one, so I guess 7 is about perhaps almost an archaic usage, and number 8 is the rather fantastic new and improved use of continuous or progressive verb tenses in English, because I think McDonald's may have.
That's always the example, right?
Right? I'm loving it. But I don't know that I'd correct this anymore. It's in spoken English, so there you go.
So all right, as a teacher, I think it's also just fun to do irregular plurals. So I correct dice. I don't like dice. It's a die. And as a teacher, it's also kind of like a fun game to play, where we also do it with animals, right? Even if they're animals, like, okay, fish, deer, elk, like sometimes, like, and of course the obvious one, right? The ones that are in the off to class irregular plurals lesson: tooth, teeth, foot, feet, person, people. Lots of beginners, especially in Latin America, right? They don't go men, they go mans. Those are the obvious ones, but it's also fun to do ones that are archaic. So I know that it's also correct to say octopuses, right? When we're talking about an octopus. But I don't know. I like octopi and cacti, right?
Okay.
But these are kind of fun. And look, this is where, number 1, it's my experience, right? To me, for whatever reason, it bothers me if someone says dice and they mean singular. You know what else bothers me? This is another one that's really crazy. Data is a plural term, right? Datum is a singular piece of data, and I don't like it, and there's no reason for that, but it bothers me.
Yeah, you've lost that argument for sure. Yeah, technically, you are correct. Absolutely, and it brings up the point about what is considered correct usage rather than the rules. And I think I've mentioned previously, do you want to be a prescriptive teacher or a descriptive teacher, or can you be a great balance of both, saying in the context in which you're learning, this is fine, but if you were perhaps put this in an essay, and I'll come to that later about a guiding principle that I use before I get too stuck into grammar with students.
And I just want to briefly chat about number 8 too, because the state of verbs, right? I mean, that's always like, love, know, understand. Right away with students, when you hop into a lesson with them, a lower level student will say, I am seeing you, I'm hearing you. No, let's talk about state of verbs. We like things, we love things, we understand things. These are verbs that describe states, not actions. We generally don't use these in continuous tenses. And then they say, ba-da-ba-ba-ba, right? I'm loving it. And I have to say, I wish McDonald's did not do this.
and to another teacher's point who mentioned in the discussion prior to having the webinar, I think there are Englishes in which the progressive tenses or continuous tenses are used far more heavily in an acceptable way than they are in perhaps other standard forms of English.
So I think the big thing that this comes to, and we're going to get more to this later, the big determination of this is context. It's all about context. You're foreshadowing a little bit when you say some Englishes use more continuous tenses. So let's move on to the next thing. I'm going to stop delaying over the sentences, and I'm going to let you keep going, and then we'll get to the part about different Englishes.
Excellent. So a couple of points, I think there's salient points to make is, first of all, if you do want to teach English, understand that I can say that I'm certainly not an expert. And I think the greatest thing as a teacher that you can display is humility when you teach grammar. It's very, very easy to correct other people's work. It's really good to understand that you won't always be correct. And so I have a couple of reference books, and the first two, the Teacher's Grammar of English with Answers, and the second, Understanding and Using English Grammar, I think are probably of benefit to almost every ESL teacher. The third one is particularly a strong reference for me because I don't speak North American English, and so it's not something that I will ever teach. I don't think I'd ever be qualified to teach that one, but it's something for me which is an excellent reference book from time to time. So these are helpful for me to teach grammar to students.
One I can add as far as North American. So there's one called American Accent Training by Ann Cook. It's got such fun exercises.
Yes.
And my students love it, right? Because it just it plays with intonation. So we end up doing exercise like dogs eat bones. Dogs eat bones. They ate them. And how then how English is so focused on when things happen, but so sentences that are radically different can sound so close to the same. So dogs eat bones. The dogs have eaten the bones. The dogs would have eaten the bones. These things, they sound so similar. The dogs are eating the bones. So the dogs ought to have eaten the bones. You can combine these things. So it makes these amazing and fun exercises. And when I do this with students who've never done this before, they have a really good time. And again, it's only if it's relevant, right? Because only certain students who are in North America and working among other North Americans would benefit from this. But I really like it because it kind of gets them doing something. Because I teach adults, and most of them have been learning English their whole lives, but they've never played with intonation and stress. So for them, it's this completely different thing, and they get a kick out of it. So I'm not familiar with this one that you shared, but I wanted to talk about the one that I've used.
Yeah, that's great. And I think strictly speaking, phonology, stress, intonation, prosody are not technically considered part of grammar in the linguistic definition of English, but certainly within the realm of English as a second language teaching, I think it's fair to say that it is. And it's great that many people will have books that work particularly well as references. I believe that some people are going to share those, which is excellent. These are just books that have worked particularly well for me. Moving on to the next thing is, it is important as an English speaker to acknowledge all of the really strong influences that will affect the way you yourself view grammar. And I won't go through all of these here, but you will have your own, and there is no doubt that they will affect your view and the ideas around teaching. Perhaps the biggest one for me is the most important one, which I will highlight, is the fact that I learned grammar throughout my entire formal education. I don't know that it has made me a particularly strong teacher of grammar, but I have a heightened awareness of it in teaching. So I think that's a great exercise for each person to do, or if you haven't done it for a while.
Yeah, I think the key here is just knowing how your experience as an individual, as a speaker of your native language, and also for most language teachers, your experience of learning other languages, how they impact you. Because you can't step away from yourself and analyze your own experience. You're stuck in it. But it's helpful to engage in some reflection and thinking about, what are my attitudes? Where do my attitudes toward grammar come from? And also, most importantly, are these necessary? Right? Because look, honestly, it's a pet peeve of mine. It bothers me when a student says dice. But if the student says dice, is that going to prevent anyone from understanding them? No. Even there are native speakers who don't know that die is the singular of dice, right? And it bothers me when native speakers do it. So look, so for me, knowing that, like knowing what my quirks are, like ultimately that's one specific example. That's where I'm teaching from a place where I'm putting my own opinions and irritations over what is actually best for the student. But to be a better teacher would be to say, okay, Chris, it doesn't matter that it annoys you when someone says dice when they're talking about one die. If it's not going to block anyone from understanding, it's not worth spending time on. Okay, and then I'm turn back over to you. We have a comment from Jake. It says, grammar is important, but it's not a good indicator of actual proficiency in the productive skills because students can memorize the rules. Nothing beats actual speaking and writing text. So I'll turn it back over to you, James, and if you want to address that, you can.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I agree with that absolutely in principle. Yeah, it's a good comment. Okay, so here's a guiding principle, and this refers to what you were speaking about before, Chris. Is the aim of teaching is not to show the student how well you know the subject matter, although you want to have all of that background knowledge, but that should give you confidence to assist the student. For me, the guiding principle when teaching a student and the idea of teaching grammar is, to which standard of English is my student going to be held? And knowing the objectives or the reasons for which your student is learning English is paramount to determining when and if you will teach grammar.
Yeah. One really good example of this is when a student will say, I want to be a native speaker. Students say something like that all the time. So the first thing I ask is, why? Why do you want to sound like a native speaker? Because most of the English in the world, 3/4 of the English in the world, is from one non-native to another. So unless you're in a specific situation where you're interacting exclusively or primarily with native speakers, it may be counterproductive to quote unquote sound like a native, whatever that even means. And then of course the second question is, well, which native do you want to sound like? You and I sound completely different. And we're from two of like the most recognized forms of English. But there are native English speakers all over the place who speak in completely different ways. And so when you say, which I want to sound like a native speaker, what that's kind of doing is it's setting up this dynamic where Someone is like, I want to sound like someone who owns the language, and I don't own the language. But of course, the reality is that nobody owns the language. And as teachers, it's really, we can unwittingly reinforce this if we don't know about it. Because as a teacher, if you have the awareness to be like, well, actually, I don't own the language any more than you do, then you can approach this in the same way. And it also helps with what you talked about before, which was humility, right? Not assuming that I know all the rules and my way of speaking is the right way, because my way of speaking is just influenced by the one specific spot on the globe where I grew up, where we call Coke soda, but someone else might call it pop, and other people call sodas that aren't Coke also Coke, which sounds insane to me. But there are hundreds of examples, hundreds. So that it's so important to ask this question: what standard does my student need to have? And that changes dramatically how we teach, right? Is the student interacting with native speakers? Are they interacting with other non-natives? Like, these are questions that once you become aware of this, you can ask the student, and this will help you be a better teacher because you're helping the student get more out of your time together. So I think this is super important.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. I think you clarified that point really well, and knowing what a student's goal is. If a student has arrived as a newcomer with a language very different to English as the mother tongue, then perhaps they're going to be looking for, they just arrived, I don't know, let's say a refugee status. Their needs for learning a daily functional English is very different to the student who wants to come on and get a band 8 in IELTS, and that should guide you enormously as to what you teach. Okay, so just a couple of the methods. Obviously, there are many more, and these have changed name over time, but I think the two that are certainly worth knowing and that are heavily used and even mixed together in off-the-class materials are inductive and deductive. And I've given a very simplistic breakdown. The idea of inductive is let the students work out as much of it as you can before you come in with the teacher-centric deductive system. So there's no right or wrong, but most textbooks published around today for ESL students tend to work towards a student-centric approach, and that they will be the ones to work this out before the teacher comes in with a grammar table and says with the laser pointer and figure it out. So, excuse me. What I've done here is taken a few slides to finish with and show you inductive versus deductive. Primarily because, and I've chosen this lesson primarily because it's a lesson I've received an enormous amount of feedback around, and it's due to it being at the C1 level, and it's about something called negative or restrictive adverbials. And I remember when we first published these lessons, I had people saying, grammar's a waste of time, my students will just work this out. And while I agree to a certain extent, there are areas of the English language that I believe are almost impossible to teach without a blend of both inductive and deductive. It's very hard for students to work out what restrictive adverbials are. Yes, perhaps they're not going to be needed in everyday speech, but you do hear them a lot in English. There are a lot of fixed expressions, and then in writing, it's certainly something for academic English or for C1 learners that they would want. So I've chosen to finish a couple of slides here because I've told you that this is about restrictive adverbials. And so the first thing is here, there is no restrictive adverbial on this slide here, but the idea is to start giving an enormous amount of context. And on the right, you can see there are, from A to D, there are standard sentences in English, which I think are all in the present perfect or the past simple, to get started talking about things in the past. And then, still using the inductive method, you would move into something with even greater context. And what we have on the left are the sentences here that appeared in the previous slide. So the student should have familiarity with these phrases, understanding that they occurred in the past. And yet what they need to do is look at the text on the right and find a sentence or something with in the article that express a similar reason. And as soon as if they can do that task, they will be pulling out phrases or sentences with restrictive adverbials in them, and they can immediately start to compare them back. So you're guiding them very, very slowly without, explicitly saying this is what's going to happen. You get another repeat at this, and you can see already on the left-hand side, now we have these restrictive or negative adverbial. Why am I saying adverbials? Adverbials, and on the right, you will have perhaps a more basic expression in English. And you can even see here that the sentence, the dialog box at the end asks the student to look for some patterns. So even as a teacher, this should prompt you, even with the teacher notes that provide some extra information. The idea is you want to start looking for a pattern. And then finally, this isn't the next slide, it's a slide further along in the lesson, is where you start going into more explicit teaching of the grammar. And I put in as much as I can, but I understand it's up to the teacher and again, the students involved in that class as to how much of this you will explicitly teach. So that really goes into a more teacher-centric thing. You can see there is an explanation, an example, explanation, or some more information and some examples. But essentially, you can see this is where you get an explicit explanation. In the end, you can see I'm using bold to highlight particular things. We show about the inversion of subject and the other verbs, and then specific words with barely, hardly, and no sooner, etc. So there's explicit instruction there. And that really leads you to a... Sorry.
Let me pop in here because this is interesting. One of the things that I have really noticed with the off to class slides, and this is not explicit, and we can't see it here because you're not sharing every single slide.
Yes.
But one of the things that I really like is how between some of these slides that you've shown here, there will be limited practice. And so, for example, there might be a slide where it will be fill in the gaps, but in fill in the gaps, it would be like only one word is missing. So you might like, if we look at the top left box, never before had I met someone so rude. Like the gap fill might be never before had I blank someone so rude. And the student at first just has to conjugate meet, okay? And one of the things I encounter with my students is students go into like gap fill mode, right? They're like, okay, I see a gap, I have to write it. And this is like from learning something your whole life. I think we all do this. So I always have to tell my students, look, if you just see the gap and conjugate meet in the right way, that's a present simple or a past simple activity. That's not hard, but that's not what this is for. It always is helpful to contextualize. The purpose of this exercise is because we're showing you a pattern. And before I just start explaining things to you on a complex grammar slide, this exists so that you can start to see how this pattern works. So before you just ignore the whole sentence, see a gap, see that it's past, take meet and make it met, read the whole sentence out loud and start to think about this. Read it slowly and then do the pattern. Because then what happens 2 slides later is then that gap is bigger. And instead of just conjugating meet into met, the student has to put the whole phrase in. So what people may not be aware of is how much goes into these slides and how these slides are put and organized in such a way as to give these students the tasters. And even when they're not aware of it explicitly, seeing the patterns, they're seeing these patterns and they're seeing them spelled out for them in whole sentences, and then they're asked to replicate the patterns in pieces, starting with small pieces, then bigger pieces. And in a lot of cases, that happens before the explicit instruction comes in. So that when you're doing the explicit instruction, it's the student is not, their head isn't spinning because they're seeing your reading for the first time. So I just wanted to draw attention to that and to say how much I have to contextualize these things with my students when I do these grammar slides, especially these advanced grammar slides, is I'm always having to tell students, slow down, look at the pattern, because the pattern is what we're practicing here, not the past simple.
Absolutely. And, you know, to finish, I will say that a lot of the materials are quite dense in the off to class slides, and they are organized with the idea of that you can work through them in sequence. But I think it's important to recommend, to highlight as well on this final slide that there's a lot that you can do once you get here. And you may not get through the entire slide, but you do have a form, an example of the structure. Never before had I met someone so rude. There's a great exercise in there for a teacher to, you know, keep the first 2 words, keep the first 3 words, and change the verb. And, you know, there's a lot here, and to allow students, again, to take a very small explicit piece there and allow students to find the pattern naturally and build that up by themselves. And importantly, it becomes a student-centric lesson again, and that the students are doing the production. Yeah.
Can I ask you something completely unrelated from like 3 slides ago?
Yeah.
Now, James, I know you're not a big live sports fan, but in Australia, when a match or a game ends, is it a final siren?
The final siren. Yeah, the final siren has sounded. Absolutely.
Wow.
What's it in North? I guess a siren brings an ambulance in North America,
yeah,
right?
we don't. Yeah, sirens do not end sporting events unless that's a bad ending to a sporting event. Something has gone wrong. So it depends on what sport you play. If you play like soccer, right? Football to everybody else. If you play soccer, or if you play American football, it's going to be a final whistle. But if you play basketball or hockey, there's going to be a buzzer, the final buzzer. And so, you know, in basketball, when someone makes a shot at the very last second that wins a game, it's a buzzer beater.
That's fantastic. And I think that's an example like that is a great way to end a webinar like this, is as don't ever get hung up or fall into the trap of saying to somebody too quickly, that's wrong.
I know.
Because what a buzzer for you works in that context, whereas I'm thinking I'm watching a game show revolving around a quiz. But comprehensibility is not compromised, and I think that's the main thing to come out of, you know, has the student understood? Again, we're into vocabulary perhaps and usage, but I think that's a really helpful thing when teaching grammar is comprehensibility maintained for the student, and if so, it's probably time to move on.
Okay. Well, James, this has been super informative, and I really appreciate it. And what I would like to allow people to do is comment on some of the things we've talked about. Look at the sentences. I've pasted the sentences that are they wrong or aren't they wrong? Would you say it that way? And even whether you would or wouldn't say it that way, would you correct a student that said it that way? So for me, my answer was maybe ashamedly, I would correct a student who said you need a dice. And I would correct a student who said, I'm loving it. Now, it's hard for me to tell a student they can't say I'm loving it, but I would say, let's talk about state verbs for just a minute. I just want you to be aware, because we need to know the difference, so that you might say, you know, you're drawing attention to right now, I'm really loving this McDonald's hamburger, but it doesn't really work to say, I'm hearing you, teacher. So James, any final thoughts for us?
No, I hope that you know, it's such an, as a preface with, you know, grammar and accent are 2 topics that evoke or provoke a lot of emotional responses. So I think you know, it'll be natural that people will have more to say, hopefully. And I've enjoyed it. I hope teachers got something out of this. And if there's anything further in Facebook, I will try and pop back and have a look. And I'm sure I'll get some ideas from other teachers. As I said, one of the last thing is one of the things that has influenced the way I teach grammar is the fact that I've been privileged enough to view the feedback of thousands of teachers over many years, and I still am far from getting everything right. So keeping an open mind to it and appreciating the feedback that comes from other teachers out there.
All right. Well, James, thank you so much for your time. For everyone watching, I do hope that you have found this to be enjoyable. We try to do this as much as we can. We always want you to have all the resources you need to be successful as a teacher, no matter what context you're teaching in. So however it is that you teach, we want to give you the tools to be successful. So we try to do these things as often as we can to talk about different aspects of ESL teaching. If there's something you would like to see, a topic you want to see covered, a video you'd like to see, you'd like to see us do, this is part of what we do. So definitely let us know, leave a comment, and wherever everyone is, have a great day, a great night, and we'll see you another time. All right. Thanks very much for coming, everyone. Thanks, James, for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks.